I just have to say, I know I've mentioned this before. I hope I'm not being too repetitive. I've just really been learning a lot from this series in 1 Samuel, A Leader for God. Just studying David and Saul, there's just been so many things that have come about from my reading of these passages and from our study together. And God has been showing me so many things. And I think this has happened before. It happened when we were in Nehemiah and Psalms and some of the other things we've studied. I just get the feeling that God has been bringing these passages to us because we need to hear what's in His Word. And it's very timely. And today's message is one such instance of that. I want to read together 1 Samuel 22. We're kind of closing in on the end of 1 Samuel. And today we come to 1 Samuel 22. Some great lessons here from the life of David and Saul. And there's just a real comparison here between these two leaders. And I want you to read with me. I'm in the New American Standard Version, and we'll just read the chapter and then kind of talk about what God has for us today. So David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's household heard of it, they went down there to him. And everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. Now there were about 400 men with him. And David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and my mother come and stay with you until I know what God will do for me." Then he left with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. And the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Then Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was sitting in Gibeah under the tamarisk tree, and on the height with his spear in hand, and all his servants were standing around him. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the father of Jesse, with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was standing by the servants of Saul, answered and said, "I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." Then the king sent someone to summon Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all of his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here am I, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me, and that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise up against me by lying in ambush as it is this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is faithful as David, even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house? Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant or to any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all of this whole affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's household." And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing and did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. That just means that they were the spiritual leaders, and they wore the religious clothing. And he struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep. He struck with the edge of the sword. But one son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. Then David said to Abiathar, "I knew on that day when I saw Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, 'I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me, do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. You are safe with me.'" Well, one of the things that we're going to learn from this chapter is that just because there is distress and discontentedness among a group of people, it doesn't mean that they're not charged with carrying out the will of God. We see right here in the first couple of verses all these people who have gathered around David. First it mentions his family, and then it says that everyone in verse 2 who was in distress and everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented, they gathered around him and he became captain over them. This is an interesting statement, that these folks who were discontented gathered around David. It says there were 400 of them. That's a lot of discontentment gathered around David. But just because these folks are on the run, discontented, they're in distress, it doesn't mean that God is not going to bring about his will through them. And we know that's the case. I mean, think of the Israelites in Egypt. Think of the Israelites as they were in exile in Babylon and Persia. Think of the story of Esther and how Haman was going up against the whole population of Jews and was going to kill them. And they were sort of in exile under persecution with the possibility of being annihilated. And yet God was bringing about his will through those very people. I'm just kind of making some general observations here. So we have this idea that just because this group is this ragtag bunch of David's followers doesn't mean that God isn't going to use them. And we know they were a great encouragement to David. And this is actually the beginning of David's following as king. And these folks would follow him in the years to come. And then in verse 9, we again see the villain, Doeg the Edomite, not to be confused with Doug the Edomite. That joke will never get old. But he's the guy who gave up the priests. He's the one that sort of spilled the beans about David's presence in the city of Nob. And because of that, Saul decided to have them all killed. Really, this guy, this villain, he really should be called Doeg the Opportunist, because he was using this as an opportunity to get in the good with Saul. Maybe we could call him Doeg the Tattletale, because he's telling about David's doings with Ahimelech. And then again in verse 10, we see the sword of Goliath is mentioned. I always find this interesting. It's an important relic. And here it's mentioned here. And they seem to know the story behind this. So David has a reputation, and they seem to understand this. And I also want to point out this summoning of Saul, Saul's summons. He sent someone to go and retrieve the priests and bring them up to him. And be sure that this was not a, hey, do you guys have time for a conversation? This was not like that. This was not, do you guys think, you have some time in your schedule this week where we could get together and talk about these things? No. This was go down there and get those guys up here. And I love in this passage how Ahimelech, the spiritual leader, speaks so boldly. To me, that is really encouraging. To see how he goes up against Saul and knows that his life could be on the line. It's in verses 14 and 15. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Like, do you think I just started this relationship with David? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair." So Ahimelech is standing up to Saul, and he's giving it right back to him. And he's speaking on behalf of the Lord and the Lord's people. I love that. And maybe this is a good place to just insert a comment about the separation of church and state. I think this sort of fits in here really well. I actually don't really like that language when we talk about the separation of church and state. It just doesn't seem like it really describes the role of the church in society, as if the church is on the same plane with the political sphere, like the church is a parallel organization alongside of some other political parties. Like we just represent sort of one wing of special interests. Be sure that the church, God's church, Christ's bride, is not just another political party at the table for these political conversations. The church is to be a force of change. And I see Ahimelech here speaking very boldly, putting his life on the line. They always say, I know this is an old joke, they always say if you're a pastor, you're supposed to be able to preach, pray, or die at any given moment. And hopefully that won't happen, but I know I'm always ready to preach on Sunday, and no one has threatened my life over it, but I think that's true for all of us as Christians, that we're to be bold. We're to go out into the world and make a difference and to speak on behalf of the interests of God. Augustine said, all the world is our parish. Sometimes we say, well, that's the responsibility of another church down the street, or, that's not in our area. Augustine said, all the world is our parish. And that should be our perspective. And then another observation of this passage is that, and I think it's kind of an obvious observation, is there can be a cost to following the Lord. There can be a cost to doing what's right. And Ahimelech was willing to pay that cost. He was willing to pay the price to do what was right. Last week we referenced Jesus' comment in Matthew when the Pharisees were accusing the disciples of picking the grain on Sunday. And Jesus referenced this very incident, the incident in the last chapter that we looked at last week, where the priest had given David and his men the consecrated bread. And Jesus was making the point that mercy is the higher calling here. And he's saying that's what Ahimelech did. He was being merciful to God's servant. So Ahimelech did what was right in God's eyes, and he was killed as a result of it. Sometimes there's a cost to do what's right. I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I read the story of his life and how he came to America, was called here by some professor friends, and he was teaching in an American university. But he felt such guilt that he should go back and be with his people in World War II, knowing that it could cost him his life. So he went back, and sure enough, he was put to death in the gas chambers during World War II. Sometimes doing what's right will bear a cost. Well, interesting that in this passage there are a number of contrasts. And I want to look at these contrasts this morning because I really think they help us get at the heart of the difference between David and Saul and why God described David as a man after his own heart. So we're going to look at 5 contrasts in this passage this morning. Maybe you've already kind of gotten your eye on some of them. And this first one, contrast number 1, is really more of a general observation. And I want to be really careful here because I'm comparing the insiders and the outsiders and drawing the conclusion that Doeg was really an insider. He was really an outsider. He was an Edomite. He was not a Jew. And like I said, I want to be careful with this because I know he did a very evil thing. But it's just sort of a general observation about life, that there are insiders and there are outsiders. And if I had to add another category, I might put in here that there are outsiders trying to be insiders. That's just a commentary on life, and we see this here with Doeg. You know, Saul had his insiders, these men who were by his side. And Doeg was not necessarily one of them, but he was sort of an indentured servant of Saul, not being a Jew himself, but was an Edomite. And I think Doeg uses this opportunity to try to get up close to Saul, to earn some brownie points with Saul by killing these servants of the Lord. And he's not an outsider like David is an outsider at this point. But he's still an outsider of sorts. You know, insiders keep their mouths shut because they want to avoid trouble, and that's what Saul's right-hand men did. They all stayed quiet. We see that a couple of times here in this passage. Insiders avoid drama because they don't want to disrupt their own peace. They just want things to remain peaceful. They don't want to stick their necks out. Insiders are more concerned about personal peace than truth. Outsiders aren't afraid of the truth. They're not concerned about their status in the group because they have none. And sometimes there's a freedom, like Doeg felt this freedom to just say, hey, I saw David down here with the priest of Ahimelech, and explains what was going on down there. Insiders are motivated to keep the country club atmosphere as it is. Don't say too much. You know, don't put your neck out. This could bring about trouble. Just keep quiet. Insiders are motivated to keep that country club atmosphere going. Insiders can't seem to see the elephant that's right in front of them. And outsiders, all they can do, they just want to talk about the elephant because they don't care about their status within the group. And Doeg the Edomite was an outsider. But I bet he moved a little closer to the inside when he made this move and killed all these folks. And Saul probably brought him up a notch. So that's contrast number 1. Contrast number 2, we have on one side David's statement where he said, until I know, and Saul's question in 22:13 when he said, when he asked about them, when he asked, why did you inquire of God for him? So on the one side, you have David's statement, until I know. And on the other side, you have Saul's question, why did you inquire of him, of the Lord? And I think in both of these statements, it reveals the character of each man. So let's look at David's statement. It really shows his ultimate trust in the Lord. His father was there with him in Moab, and he asked the king of Moab, can my father stay here until I know what the Lord will do for me? There's a whole lot in that statement. And that statement for a long time, well before I started this series, has sort of worked into my mind and my thinking. I actually was trying to get a book published by the title, Until I Know. I thought this was a great idea, but the publisher didn't think so, so whatever. But I think this really reveals David's character, that he was waiting on the Lord. He wanted to know what the Lord was doing before he made a move. David is saying, I won't make a move until I know what God will do for me. I'm not going to do another thing until I'm sure that God is working on my behalf. Everything is on hold until God is moving. David is making everything else subordinate to the intentions of God. And this is what the righteous do. They wait upon the Lord. They wait to see where God is moving and what God is doing. There's an effort to try to align ourselves with God and what He wants for us. It's just what the righteous do. The wicked, on the other hand, they plan their own schemes. They never check with the Lord. They just plow ahead with their own plans and schemes. Psalm 21:11 says, though they plot evil against you and devise wicked schemes, they cannot succeed. We're comparing here the way of the righteous and the way of the wicked. And the way of the wicked will never succeed. It will never have the Lord's blessing. Even if for a while it seems like the wicked are succeeding, in the end it cannot. Because God is always for the righteous and against the wicked. And Saul's question in 22:13 really reveals his character. This just speaks volumes about Saul's character. He says, why did you inquire of God for him? Imagine that. How dare you go to the Lord and ask the Lord what He would have you do here? I mean, wouldn't a wise person want to check with the Lord? Wouldn't that be the righteous thing to do? It's not even a part of Saul's thinking, though. Wouldn't Saul want to be aligned with God's plan? And that's just it. It was always about Saul and his own agenda, his own plan. I think so much of the spiritual life is just learning to submit to the Lord and His will. I think that's what that big word sanctification means. So much of it is just learning that God is God and we're not, and submitting to Him. So that's contrast number 2. In contrast number 3, you have these guards who would not put the priest to death in 22:17, and Doeg, who killed every living thing. It's a terrible thing. It's hard to even read this because what he did was such a terrible thing, killing these innocent people. So these guards of Saul, though, he turns to them and he said, put the priest to death. And they wouldn't do it. And the assumption here is that it was because of their fear of the Lord. They were not going to go up against God's righteous servants. So guards' closest men would not kill the priests. Both David and Saul had their men by their side. This is sort of an offshoot comparison here, another contrast. But both of these leaders had men by their sides. Saul had these guys who were allegedly supposed to be loyal, and David had this ragtag bunch of people who came alongside of him and followed him. And though they weren't a very organized group, though they weren't considered the official leaders of Israel at that time by people, God was working through these people. And God was going to work out His plan. I think it's interesting, too, that Saul's trying to get these guys to do his dirty work. He didn't care who did it. He just wanted somebody to do this dirty work and sort of help him appease his anger and take out this vengeance on these priests. And I mean, just imagine Saul going that far that he would kill the priests, knowing that it could very well bring judgment down on his house. He didn't care. That's how angry and how bitter Saul was. Saul's closest men, though, knew better than to mess with the Lord's anointed. There's a great verse in 1 Chronicles 16:22, which says, this is an Old Testament commandment, do not touch my anointed ones. Do my prophets no harm. Because these are the people that the Lord sent to speak to His people and to bring messages from the Lord to His people. It was the system was there to bring people into alignment in the Old Testament with the Lord's will. Saul didn't care anything about all of that. He was going to do what he was going to do. And he brought these guys down very quickly. Verse 20 says that Doeg killed every living thing. So that's tough stuff to read in the Bible. It's hard to understand. And Saul had to be just this sycophant leader, just this crazy dictator of a person. And sycophants, they often find themselves surrounded by people who are willing to do some dirty work. And though his own men wouldn't do it, it wasn't hard to find somebody who would. This all happened in a matter of minutes. And I was thinking back to the situation with the Amalekites. I don't know if you remember back this far. It was 1 Samuel 15. Back when the Lord told the Israelites to go into the camp of the Amalekites and kill every man, every woman, every child, and it said to kill all of the donkeys, the camel, and the sheep, and it listed very specifically. It almost reads exactly like this verse here, what Doeg did in verse 20. And what a comparison that Saul was told by the Lord to kill the enemies of the Lord, and he wouldn't do it. And here we see Saul going after God's anointed ones, knowing that that was the wrong thing to do. It really shows a picture of who Saul is. And I love that passage when Samuel, back in 1 Samuel 15, Samuel comes to the Israelites and he's questioning them, what did you do in the camp of the Amalekites? And, we did what the Lord told us to do, was sort of the response. And he said, what is this bleating of the sheep I hear in my ears? Very sarcastic, telling them that they did not do what the Lord told them to do. But here Saul has no problem killing God's servants, their families, and their livestock. It really shows the contempt that Saul had toward the Lord and how far he'd come from serving and being submitted to the Lord. What an evil thing to do by Saul. How do you know who the evil ones are? How do we know who the evil ones are? We've said this before. Look to see who's persecuting the righteous, and you'll know who the evil are. Well, how do you know these people are evil? Well, we know they're evil because they're persecuting and killing the righteous. Isaiah 32:7 says, "Scoundrels use wicked methods. They make up evil schemes to destroy the poor with lies, even when the plea of the needy is just. Even when they know what they're doing is wrong, they plow ahead and do it anyway." That's how you know what evil is. Saul's heart had come so far, and he had traveled so far away from the Lord, he could not see what the Lord wanted for him to do. So that's contrast number 3. Contrast number 4. We have David on the run on one side, and on the other side we have Saul under the tamarisk tree. I think this is such a visual picture of these two men. David's on the run. We have this little geography lesson here. It sort of reads like The Princess Bride. You remember that movie? And they had all these places, the Forest of Doom or whatever it was. Sounds almost like this passage here. Verse 1, we have David in the cave of Adullam. And what was David doing in the cave? He was hiding. And then in verse 3, we have David going to Mizpah of Moab. I don't know the timeline here, but it was a relatively short period of time that David is going to these places. And what was David doing in Mizpah? He was on the run. He was on the run. And then verse 4, the stronghold it mentions. We don't know where this was exactly, but occasionally David would go to the stronghold, and it was a place where he was hiding, but it was a place where he was ready for war. David was preparing himself for an attack in case that should happen. And then verse 5, the forest of Hereth. And what was he doing in the forest of Hereth? He was hiding, trying to hide from Saul. And David in these places is sort of on a search for the perfect hiding place, the perfect position to save his life and the men with him. He wanted to defend himself. When I was a kid, we used to play these street games. You played street games, right? Kick the can and these other games kids play out in the road. Kids don't play on the road anymore, but we used to do that. And we used to play a game called 50 More. And the game went like this. We had a telephone pole across the street from the house. And somebody would close their eyes and count to 50, and all the kids would run and go hide. And then that person would turn around and they would try to find people who were hiding. And they'd say, I see David hiding behind the red car. And if you were hiding behind the red car, you had to come out. And you had to stand there by the pole. And then he'd call out other people and say, okay, I see you. And they have to come. And somebody would try to run to the pole without having their name called and tag the pole. If you tagged the pole, everybody was free and you all ran. It was a great game to play out in the road, especially in the dark. And then that person would just dread, oh, I got to count to 50 again, and everybody go run and hide. The whole idea of the game, though, was to try to find a better hiding place. Like if you got caught, then the next time you're like, okay, I got to hide better than last time, and you would look for a good hiding place. That's what David's doing. He's trying to find the best hiding place until he could figure out what God was going to do. David's a pretty smart guy. And even though deep down I think David knew the Lord was going to spare him because the Lord had anointed him. He was anointed king. And he was just trying to figure out how is all this going to play out. So that's where David is. He's on the run and hiding. Well, where is Saul? Saul's under the tamarisk tree. Why do you go under a tree? You go under a tree because there's shade there. And he's there with his men. So while David is hiding and on the run, Saul is hanging out under a tree, seemingly at ease with his men. Not afraid for his life, even though because he was working against the Lord, he probably should have been. But here he is, relaxed, hiding under the tree, just hanging out under the tree, and probably conniving another plan, trying to figure out where David would be. Isn't that a commentary on the wicked? To be at ease while they're scheming evil? We see that in the world. When people are doing something evil, they seem to be at ease. They seem to be at peace. And maybe we feel like we're on the other end at times and facing the persecution of the person who's doing evil. And when you're in that situation, you're not at ease. You're like David, hiding and on the run. I think that's just a commentary on life. When you have the wicked going after the righteous, it's the innocent. It's the righteous who are feeling the stress and paying the price. And maybe you can remember times when you've been on either side of that scenario. And I think the way that this plays out, it just makes the wickedness seem that much more wicked. It's someone who's doing wrong is at ease and not paying the price for their evil deeds. But that's just the way it is with the wicked. They seem to go unpunished, but we know from Scripture that it's only temporary. We know that this isn't their permanent status, because we know that God is righteous and God is the judge, and He will one day work all things out for His purposes. So we come to contrast number 5 as we sort of wind this down. And we see a contrast between Saul's paranoia and David's confident trust in God's protection. We have Saul's paranoia and we have David's confidence in the Lord. Now I want to kind of paraphrase this with the idea that, last week we saw David and he wasn't looking so confident. And I just think that that's a commentary on life, that we don't always seem 100% confident in the Lord. But ultimately, we see David going back to his trust in the Lord. And that's the picture we have here. But notice Saul's paranoia. I want to read verse 8 and verse 13. Verse 8 says, "For all of you," he's talking to his own men, "all of you had conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me, or discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is that day. Imagine that, Saul thinking that David is lying in ambush for him when exactly the opposite is happening. There's a great commentary on what's happening today in our world, that those who are doing wicked are actually the ones that, there's a reason why they're paranoid. So this is what we have here with Saul. He's very paranoid. And I think this is just indicative of evil dictators. Had these men really conspired against Saul? No. They did not conspire against Saul. They were not scheming against him. They had probably just learned to keep their mouths shut. Probably just learned like, hey, don't say anything. You don't want to stick your neck out. I do think that silence speaks volumes sometimes. I think you can learn more from a person's silence than from their words sometimes. But in this case, I don't think these guys were really all that knowledgeable of everything that was going on. And it really shows Saul's paranoia. And the fact that wickedness will always leave you feeling paranoid. If you've ever done something that you later knew was wrong, there could be some paranoia associated with your deeds. If we act in that way, we're going to pay the price. Wickedness always leaves you with a paranoia. Proverbs 28:1, the wicked flee, though no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. I love that verse. And then Proverbs 16:5, another one. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. What does it mean to be proud of heart? This is a temptation for all of us. I feel this temptation sometimes to be proud of heart. Being proud of heart is when you think you can sneak something by the Lord. When you think that I'm going to get away with this little scheme and God's not going to be any the wiser. That's what it means to be proud of heart, and that's a temptation for all of us. But this verse tells us that the proud of heart won't go unpunished, because God is always upholding the righteous and bringing judgment on the wicked. And then on the other side, we have David's confidence in the Lord. And I mentioned last week, we saw David sort of floundering. But this week, I love that the passage ends with David's statement to Ahitub that you are safe with me. And I was thinking about that this week. How can David say that? Like last week, he was alone and afraid, and he's been on the run. But Ahitub comes to him and tells him about this, and then we have that beautiful confession of David that it was his action of going to Nob and his action of taking the bread that caused the priest to die. David saw that as falling on him. That in itself, I think, is a commentary on the righteous. That they take responsibility and they feel the need to look out for those who are innocent. That's a sign of righteousness. But we got to ask the question, how was David at this moment so confident that he could offer safety to Ahitub? I think it's because ultimately, down in David's heart, even though we saw him floundering, running, hiding, all these things, last week, his desperation of acting like a maniac, like he lost his sanity just to save his hide. And this week he makes this declaration, you're safe with me. How can he promise that? I think it's because ultimately, in that moment, he was trusting that the Lord was going to work on his behalf. And I think this is a commentary for you and I. This is a note that we need to make for our own lives. That sometimes we have this great confidence in the Lord, and sometimes, we're feigning insanity because we don't know what to do. And David, in this moment, is trusting in the Lord. He knows that ultimately the Lord has had him anointed as king. And he's standing on God's promises. And I think that's a great encouragement for you and I, to stand on God's promises, to know that he's looking out for our best interests. And so really that's our takeaway today. I think we've touched on something here that shows why David is called a man after God's own heart. We're seeing David's character. We see his pursuit of the Lord over his lifetime, even though there were times when David floundered, even though there were times that David sinned. Deep down in his heart, he wanted to be a person who was pursuing the Lord throughout his lifetime. It's not that he never messed up. He messed up, and this isn't the last time these things that happened in the previous chapter. This is not the last time we know that David messes up. But over and over again, he continues to come back to the Lord and to pursue the Lord and to build his confidence and his trust in God's promises for him. And I don't know, maybe you're feeling today the pressures of a trial. Maybe you're feeling your faith tested. Could be. I think the challenge for all of us is to be like David and to press on. No matter if we're having strong times of faith or weak times of faith, to keep pressing on, to pursue God over a lifetime, even in difficulties. That's what it means to be a person after God's own heart. To trust in the Lord in difficult things. To believe that he who began a good work in you will complete it. That's a promise we can stand on. That's how you build a life of faith like David. That's how you become a person after God's own heart. Let's pray.